In the year 1939, the tiny town of Goebbelsville, Indiana, was as quiet and ordinary as any small farming community in America. Days passed with the rhythm of the harvest, the toll of church bells, and the hum of simple lives untouched by the world's chaos. For the families here, life was predictable, almost comforting. But for John and Ruth Miller, that peace would not last. The birth of their daughter Mary seemed like a blessing at first, an innocent child born into a world still reeling from the Great Depression. No one could have imagined that this small farmhouse, nestled among Indiana's rolling fields, would become the setting for one of the strangest and most chilling cases ever recorded. Because as Mary grew, it became clear she was not like other children. Mary's early years in Goebbelsville seemed perfectly ordinary. She was a rosy-cheeked farm baby, bundled in wool blankets during Indiana's bitter winters and carried out into the sunlit fields once spring returned. Her laughter filled the little wooden farmhouse, and her parents, John and Ruth, felt certain they had been given the gift of a normal, happy child. But around the age of 2, something began to unsettle them. At first, it was subtle. Mary's babbling didn't sound like the scattered nonsense of most toddlers. Her syllables carried structure, as though she were mimicking a rhythm her parents couldn't quite place. Ruth would stop mid-task, laundry in her hands, listening to her daughter's strange play speech, and whisper to John at night, "Doesn't it sound different?" The words grew sharper. Patterns began to repeat, and soon Mary's babble no longer resembled English at all. It was as if she had locked onto a language that no one in their family or in all of Goebbelsville had ever spoken. Her parents tried to dismiss it. After all, children invent games, songs, and gibberish. But by her 3rd birthday, the sounds spilling from her mouth were unmistakably organized, consistent, and filled with an uncanny fluency. One evening, John overheard Mary speaking in her crib, not the nonsense rambling of a child, but flowing sentences, confident, fluid, carrying tones that rose and fell like music. He called Ruth into the room. Together, they stood frozen in the doorway, listening as their daughter, barely a toddler, spoke words neither of them could comprehend. At first, they told themselves it was a phase. Maybe she was imitating sounds from the radio, or copying something she'd overheard from a stranger passing through town. But by her 3rd birthday, when a visiting neighbor leaned in close one afternoon and gasped, "Do you realize she's speaking Chinese?" John and Ruth's world tilted on its axis.
Their child wasn't playing. She wasn't babbling. She was speaking fluent Chinese, words and phrases far beyond her years, in a language no one in Goebbelsville had ever taught her.
John and Ruth Miller were stunned. Their family had no ties to China. No neighbors spoke the language. No travelers through Goebbelsville had ever uttered words their daughter could have overheard. In 1939, a child raised on an Indiana farm should have known only the soft drawl of Midwestern English. Yet Mary spoke with the fluency of someone born halfway across the world. At first, they tried to keep it private, hoping the phase would pass. But Mary's command of the language grew stronger by the day. She would chatter endlessly, forming sentences with ease, as though the words were second nature. When her parents tried to redirect her to English, she would shake her head, frustrated, and return to the language they couldn't understand. Word began to spread through Goebbelsville. Some dismissed it as a trick, claiming John and Ruth must be exaggerating. Others whispered darker things, wondering what it meant that a child in their town was speaking in tongues. By the time Mary turned 4, her case had caught the attention of scholars beyond Indiana. Linguists, curious and skeptical, traveled to meet her. One expert, a professor from Chicago, sat across from Mary in the farmhouse kitchen and asked her to repeat certain phrases. What he heard left him shaken. Not only was the child fluent, her speech was threaded with expressions and idioms long out of use, words so old-fashioned that even modern Chinese speakers rarely recognize them. She spoke as though she had stepped out of another century, her tiny voice echoing with the weight of history. The experts confirmed the impossible. Mary wasn't just parroting sounds. She was speaking with knowledge no American farm child could ever possess. And that raised a terrifying question. How could a little girl in 1930s Indiana know this? As the years passed, Mary's strange gift only deepened. She began to drift away from the ordinary games of childhood. While other children in Gobblesville played hopscotch in the dirt roads, Mary spent hours bent over scraps of paper, sketching symbols and characters her parents couldn't decipher. They would later learn she was writing in Chinese. Then came the maps. John often kept an old atlas tucked on a bookshelf, a relic from his school days. One afternoon, Mary pulled it down, flipping through its yellowed pages with intent far beyond her years. Her tiny finger pressed firmly against a spot in rural China. "Take me here," she said. At first, her parents laughed, thinking it was a child's whim. But Mary returned to that page again and again, her voice growing more insistent each time. "Here, this is where I belong." Her demands grew relentless. She would wake in the night, crying, pointing toward the atlas as though pulled by an invisible thread. Ruth tried to soothe her with lullabies. John attempted stern refusals, but nothing silenced the urgency in Mary's pleas. Day after day, she repeated the same phrase, "Take me there." The Millers wrestled with disbelief. Was this madness, imagination, or something else, something they dared not name? Fear pressed on them from all sides, fear of ridicule, fear for their daughter's sanity, fear of what they might find if they actually gave in. But love has its own kind of power, and in the end, desperation overcame doubt. John and Ruth made a decision no parents should ever face. They packed their belongings, gathered what little savings they had, and prepared for a journey across the world, following their daughter into the unknown. In the summer of 1946, the Millers left the safety of Gobblesville behind. Their neighbors called it madness, a farm family crossing the world in the aftermath of war, chasing the visions of a little girl. But John and Ruth pressed on, clutching the hope that somewhere in this journey lay answers. The voyage was long and grueling. Days on crowded ships gave way to rickety trains clattering across the Chinese countryside. Through each stage of travel, Mary's demeanor shifted. At first, she sat quietly, watching landscapes blur past with a strange intensity. But the closer they drew to the heart of rural China, the more restless she became. Her eyes darted to the windows, her small hands clenched into fists. It was as though some invisible magnet was pulling her forward. By the time their train wound through the mountains, Mary could no longer sit still. She stood on the worn wooden benches, tugging at her mother's arm, pointing furiously out the window. Villages and fields passed in a blur, but Mary's urgency grew sharp, undeniable. Suddenly she cried out, her voice breaking the silence of the carriage, sharper, deliberate. "Stop! Stop the train!" Passengers turned their heads, startled by the American child screaming in perfect Chinese. John tried to calm her, whispering that they couldn't stop in the middle of nowhere. But Mary's cries only grew louder. She pressed her palms against the glass, tears streaming down her face, repeating the same command over and over. "Here, now, stop the train." And with her pleas echoing through the rattling carriage, the Millers faced the impossible. Trust the strange instincts of their daughter, or risk losing the one chance to uncover the truth. When the train finally screeched to a halt at a lonely rural stop, Mary wasted no time. She leapt down onto the platform before her father could even steady her, her small frame charged with a purpose far too great for a child. Without hesitation, she pointed down a dirt road winding into the countryside. "This way," she said. And though their hearts pounded with doubt, John and Ruth followed. The path led them through rice fields shimmering in the afternoon light, past homes where villagers stopped and stared at the strange American family, being led by a determined little girl. At last, Mary stopped in front of an old farmhouse, its wooden beams sagging, its walls stained by years of wind and rain. Without a moment's, she darted forward, pounding on the door with tiny fists. The door creaked open. An elderly man stood framed in the shadowed doorway. His eyes widened as he took in the child before him. But Mary didn't wait for introductions. She pushed past him, slipping into the dimly lit house as though she had crossed that threshold 1,000 times before. Her parents called after her in panic, but Mary moved with uncanny certainty. Through the musty air of the farmhouse, she marched to a bare wall in the main room. Without hesitation, she dropped to her knees, pressing her fingers along the cracks between bricks. Her hands stopped at one particular stone, worn smooth with age. With a strength fueled by sheer determination, she pried it loose. From the hollow behind it, she pulled a small dust-covered object. It was a doll, its fabric faded, its edges frayed, as though it had been hidden away for decades. Mary clutched it to her chest, her eyes glistening with recognition, not discovery. At that moment, their parents felt the floor drop beneath them. This was no game, no accident. Their daughter had led them across the world, to this exact farmhouse, to this exact hidden place, to reclaim something that had once been hers. The doll hung in Mary's hands like a relic, its faded cloth barely holding together. She clutched it tightly, then slowly turned to face the old man who still stood frozen in the doorway. Her voice, usually high and childlike, dropped to a whisper. "Don't you remember me? This was mine." The words sliced through the air like a blade. The old man's face drained of color. Ruth felt her knees weaken, and John's hand tremble at his side. But Mary wasn't finished. The old man staggered back a step, his lips trembling, his eyes wide with disbelief. Ruth tried to pull Mary close, but the child resisted, her gaze still burning into his. And then, with a steadiness no child should ever possess, she spoke again. "I'm your daughter, the one who died. You promised to keep it safe for me." The air collapsed into stillness. John and Ruth clutched each other, unable to process what they had just heard. The old man staggered, tears brimming in his eyes, his body shaking as though he had seen a ghost, because in that moment he knew the impossible was true. The little girl standing in his home was the reincarnation of his own child, lost decades ago. The farmhouse encounter marked the end of the Miller's search, but not the end of the questions. For Mary's parents, there was no way to deny what they had seen with their own eyes. Their little girl had led them across the world, to a house she had never known, to a secret no stranger could have told her. And in the presence of that old man, she had reclaimed a piece of a life that should have been lost forever. Experts tried to explain it away, calling it coincidence, subconscious memory, even trickery. But no explanation could erase the image of a child pulling a hidden doll from a wall she had never touched before. No theory could explain how a farm girl from Indiana spoke a language her family had never heard, laced with phrases that had vanished centuries ago. If Mary's story is true, And to this day, many insist it is. It may stand as one of the only confirmed cases of reincarnation in human history. A chilling reminder that death may not be the end, but a doorway. And that leaves us with a question we cannot escape. If a little girl in Indiana could carry the memories of a life lived thousands of miles away, what memories are waiting, buried deep inside the rest of us?